So it's part 2 of lesson 8, and we've kind of done an overview of Google sign-in and how that's going to work. So we're in the Google Developer Console. Now, I created a project in my class yesterday, so it will typically default to your last project. If you've never been here before, you won't see any project yet. So I'm just going to click on this little drop down to create a new project. So you can click create a new project, and I'm going to give the project a name. I'll call it Global Grub. Now, we're only really going to use the Oauth client for Google login. But if we were using other Google APIs and services for our Global Grub store, like let's say we wanted Google Maps or reCAPTCHA, we could bundle all of those APIs under this one project. It asks for an organization. You can leave it as no organization. You don't have to put anything here. So I'll just click on create. So it tells me my project got created, and once it's done, I will just click on select project to open my new Global Grub project. So you'll see it in the notifications that your new project is created, tell you your task is finished, give you a little green checkbox. Okay, so just put in a unique project name if you want. Add your student number to it, for example. Doesn't really matter what the project is called, just something so that you can associate it with this web application. You call it Global Grub, 2003, the rest of your student number, that should be unique. So give that another try. That should work. So I'll click on select project. And it'll open you up to this screen. Okay, good. Thanks, Ilya. Once we're into the project, we want to start with the Oauth Consent screen. So over here on the left, you've got 6 links. Oauth Consent screen is the 4th link on the left. There's details here about all these things. We are going to just pick external user type, so any Google account can log in. They don't have to be within our organization. So pick external and click on create. Oauth Consent screen should be here on the left. You can also choose your project once it's created. There'll be a little drop-down list right here beside the word Google Cloud Platform. So you should be able to choose your project from here if it doesn't open already. So this Oauth Consent screen, it gives you a preview of what the Google sign-in screen is going to look like, and it will say, the display name of the project wants to access your Google account. So that comes from this app name, which I will call Global Grub. So Global Grub will appear up here and in here. You need to supply the email address of your Google account here under user support email. So those first 2 figures are required. Okay, were you able to, for those of you who don't see it, were you able to create your project? Does the project show up here? Okay, if the project wasn't created, you'll need to go back. you'll need to click here and choose New Project and create the project for starters. Because you can't do anything until the project gets made. So once the project is created, you should be able to select it. It should show up here in your nav bar beside the word Google Cloud Platform. If your project name isn't showing up, you can click the arrow, and then you should be able to click on your Global Grub project or whatever you called it. Yes, under APIs and services, there's the OAuth consent screen. Correct, Gurley? No, Yulia, you don't need your student number there. It's just what's going to show up here. You can see the preview on the right. This is what the consent screen is going to look like. So whatever you type in app name is going to show up on these three sections. Yes, the user type is external. If you see the tabs on the left, you need to click on OAuth Consent Screen. We are configuring the OAuth Consent Screen once the project is created. So we're going to add the app name. We're going to add our email address that's associated with our Google account. And then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. It also wants the developer contact info in case Google needs to notify us about any changes we've made. To go right back from the home page, if you just click on the Google Home, you should be able to go to the APIs and services here and go to OAuth Consent Screen for your project. You're going to pick external and then put in the app name. And then put in your email address down at the bottom as well. So you're adding the app name, the user support email, and the developer contact email. These are the only three things that are required. And then you can click Save and Continue. The second item here is setting up the scopes. These are the permissions mentioned. Everywhere that is required, you need to fill out. You will see a star on three of the boxes. It's the first two, as well as the very last input. Any email, Gurleen. So the scope is asking, what kind of access are we asking for from users' Google accounts? So we're going to click on this Add or Remove Scopes button. All we really care about is their email address of their Google account. We don't need their full profile or anything else. So I'm going to just check off this first API, the authuserinfo.email. And then I scroll down to the bottom and click on Update. So click Add or Remove Scopes over here in the main page, and in the window that opens, check off authuserinfo.email. And then click Update. It will now show the email under non-sensitive scopes. And we'll click Save and Continue to go to the next step. We don't need to create any test users here, so we will just save and continue. And it gives us a summary that our user type is external. It's got the app name and support email we configured on the OAuth consent screen step 1, as well as the contact email. So we can just click back to dashboard down at the bottom. We don't have to make any changes. It'll now bring us here, bring us back to the Oauth Consent screen. And we want to publish the app. Notice under publishing status, it sets it to testing. And there's info here. Once we set it in production, the app will be available to any Google account. If the app is in testing, then we can give access to specific Google accounts only. We don't really care about that, so I'm going to click Publish App. And it says, do you want to push to production? The app will be available to any user with a Google account. So I'm going to confirm this is fine. And the status, publishing status, now instead of saying in testing, it says in production. If we want to put it back to testing, we would just click that button. So we want our status here, publishing status, to say in production. So you can click the publish button and click confirm in the little window that opens. And our next step in the Google console is to go to the credentials area. We now need to set up an Oauth client and let Google generate a set of API keys that we can use in the project. So make sure your publishing status says in production. And then click on the credentials link under APIs and services. And it will bring you here. And it says no API keys, no Oauth clients, no service accounts. We're going to click this blue Create Credentials link. And it asks, which kind do you want? We want this one. We want this Oauth Client ID, requesting user consent so our app can access the user data. So choose Oauth Client ID. And we've got to provide Google with some info here. First thing it wants to know is what platform is our application. We're going to choose, obviously, web. It will automatically give us a default name of Web Client 1. I'm just going to leave that. You could change it if you like, but it's fine. I'm just going to leave it. And now it wants the redirect URIs. It says users will be redirected to this path after they have authenticated with Google. The path will be appended with an authorization code for access. So what are we going to use here? I'm going to go and grab the homepage URL of our global grub site. So this will be my local host along with my port that starts with 443. I'm going to copy that. And under the authorized redirect URIs, I'm going to click the Add URI button down at the bottom. I'm going to paste it in, and then I'm going to add on to the end /signin-Google. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. So you are going to, just so you can see, you're going to replace the XX with your local org number. So everyone's project is going to run on localhost 443, but we are all going to have probably different values for those last two numbers. So my project is set to run on 44321, but probably each person in the class, because Visual Studio just assigns those port numbers randomly. So Alex will have different one from Manjinder, from Jackie. Yes. So Jackie, when you are deploying your site, exactly. So for your assignment, you need both the localhost redirect URI, so you can test it locally. And then you'll either need your live Azure domain, or if you're using smarter ASP like Manjinder, you'll need that URL with /signin-Google at the end. And then I'm going to click create. So I will address both those questions. And so in your assignment, so in slide 7, I've documented this process. So you'll create the client ID, it's a web application, and you'll add both your local and live URLs that are followed by /signin-Google. So Dhruv is asking, why do we need this? Good question. So Dhruv, let's take a look at the instructions from Microsoft. So it tells us to go to the Google console and create our Oauth Client ID. Okay, so we just did that. It says, choose web application, provide a name. And then it tells us in the authorized redirect URIs, it should always be our domain /signin-Google. So Dhruv, you're asking why. I will explain. In order for the Google sign-in to work in Visual Studio, we're going to be using this library. We're going to be adding it to our project in a minute in Visual Studio. So here is the library. We can actually, it's open source. We can see the code on GitHub. So the documentation tells us, should be telling us. Wow, this site's really slow. So inside of this library, actually, sorry, we want this one. That URL, Dhruv, sorry, this is slow, is baked into this package. Okay, so when you work with this library, that is what the Google sign-in library we're going to use. This is the URL that it's expecting. Okay, so if we want to use this package to handle the Google sign-ins, this is the URL that we need to call. So this URL is part of this library that we're going to use. Okay, does that make sense, Dhruv? So for your assignment, you'll need both the local URI as well as the live one. So that way the Google sign-in will work both when your project runs locally, but also when it's published to that domain. You're authorizing each of those URIs to use your Google application. Okay, so our work in the console is done, and it brings up this screen. It shows me the Google Client ID and the client secret. So we've done the setup in the Google console. Now we can come back to Visual Studio, and we need to do our configuring here. So the first thing we're going to do is open up our app settings file. And we are going to add a section where we can store our Google API keys. So on line 12, I'm going to add a comma at the end, And I'm going to add a new section called authentication. And then inside of the authentication section, I'm going to add a Google section. When you do your lab, you're going to add a new section after Google. You're going to add a Facebook section as well. So within the Google section, we're going to set out two keys, the client ID and the client secret. Okay, so those will default to empty strings. So here I'll leave up my screen for a second. This way, I've highlighted in blue all the new code. So starting with the comma on line 12, up to and including the closing curly brace on line 18, all of this goes before the final curly brace on line 19. So everything in blue is new. So make sure you add this to appsettings.json. Now we're going to need to make a couple of other small changes here. What else do you think we'll need to do to complete this section? Yeah, exactly, Manjinder. We need to copy from the Google console. I'm going to copy the client ID and paste it in. And then I'll copy the secret. So my client ID goes here, inside that first set of quotes, and it will end with apps.googleusercontent.com. Then I'm going to go back and copy my client secret and paste it in. So the ID is longer than the secret. So make sure you copy those values. If you close this window here, that's okay. You can always still just go back to the main credentials page. And if you click on edit over here, little pencil icon, you can see our web client that we created today. If you edit it, the client ID and client secret values are available here. You can also reset or regenerate a different secret if you ever need to. So again, if you just go to the credentials screen beside your web client 1, you can edit it, or even just click on it. The word web client 1 is a link. And your client ID and client secret, they show up here at the top right. So you can copy those values from here into your app settings file. So there's three steps we need to do the integration in Visual Studio. This was step 1. Was add the keys that we've generated in the Google console. So we're really just doing copy and paste. Step 2 is we now need to add the NuGet package. We need to add the library, the .asp.NET Core library, that will handle all the code for integrating Google sign-in. So we'll click on the Tools menu in Visual Studio, go down to the NuGet Package Manager, about halfway down, and then we want to choose the middle option, which is Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. So this gives us like a graphical interface for adding packages to the project. So follow this menu path, Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. It opens up this window. There's a few tabs here. It shows us the packages that are already installed. So these got installed when we set the project up. If we want to add a new package, we want to click on browse. So we're going to search the NuGet package site for Microsoft .ASP.NET Core .authentication.google. I'll put it in the chat. And we'll find this package, 48 million downloads. So you just click on it over here on the left. It'll get highlighted in kind of a blue, gray, purple color. We click on our project over on the right. And then that will enable this install button. So you can just click install. It'll pop up a couple of windows asking for permission. So I'll click install. It's going to make changes to the project. So I'll say OK. And then it says we have to accept the license agreement, which is fine. I'll accept the license. And now it tells me that this project package is installed. We get a little blue check mark here. And if I go back to the installed tab, now we can see that we've got the latest, we've got our packages installed here. In my Solution Explorer, if I go to the dependencies and packages, we can now see the Google authentication library has been added, so we can work with it. So now step 2 is done. Step 1, add the keys to app settings. Step 2, install the package we need. Notice it's still saying there's no external services. So step 3 is we need to add a little bit of code into our startup file to enable Google. We've got the library here, we've got the keys here, but we're not actually enabling or calling it. So that's our final step. So I'm going to open up our startup file, same file we made these few changes to in week 6. Right? We changed our require a confirm account from true to false, and we added role management for authorization. So inside this same method called configure services, it starts on line 28. We're now going to enable Google Auth. So under services, we're going to add a new authentication method, which is, we're then going to call add Google. And then we need to set up some options. So we now need to read the Google API keys, our client ID and client secret. We need to read them from our site configuration and set both the client ID and client secret in the options that come from this NuGet package we just added. So we need to read from our app settings.json we're going to use the configuration class and call get section. So this is going to read from app settings.json. We will access Google Auth section. So this object, this Google Auth variable, it's referring to this section of app settings.json. So then we can read the values. So now you can see we've got access to the client ID and client secret properties in our OAuth options. So we're going to read the client ID first, and we'll read the client secret second. Again, to be honest with you, if you actually write the code yourself, you're going to learn it better. It will work if you copy and paste it, but you're going to understand less of it than if you actually piece it together. So I'll leave it up. I'm going to put this all on GitHub shortly anyway. Fair enough. It does happen. Yep, that's good, Scott. You're gonna learn the most if you do. So I'm gonna save that. And now let's have a look. Notice now on our register and login button, register and login, that old message that said, there are no external services, that's now been replaced with a Google login button. So now I'm going to try to sign in with a Google account. I'll click the button. It brings up this Oauth Consent screen. It has our application name here. I'm already signed in with the Google account I have. So if I click it, my Ontario Tech login, it now uses that sign in Google to direct me here. Identity account, external handler, external login. It says I've successfully authenticated with Google. It copies my email address, and then it just lets me confirm. So if I click register, I'm now signed in with my Ontario Tech email. If I go and look in my database, we're actually going to see that my Google account is stored. My account is stored kind of split between a couple of different tables in the database. So here's Global Grub. So if I look in ASP.NET users, it's now got my Ontario Tech login, but notice there's no password hash. Right? The password is stored in Google. It doesn't send us the password. It has my email address. It gives me a new user ID that starts with E251. And then if I look at ASP.NET user logins, it's got this user ID and it says the provider is Google. So it knows that user account signs in with Google. It doesn't sign in. So yes, what happens? Remember, this URI in the Google console, this has to match. So it's got to match your port number. Right, I'll show you what happens if this is a mismatch. So my application, I'll just sign out here for a moment. My app runs locally at 44321. let's say in my authorized redirect, let's put it, say I put it in as 44322 and save. So now there's a mismatch. When I go to register, I'm going to get this because the URI of my project does not match the URI that's been authorized in the Google console. So they must match. When I fix it in the Google console, put it back to 44321, now it just signs me right in because I've already created the account. So we have to configure our OAuth consent screen, generate our keys, and put in the proper redirect URIs over in the Google console. Attila, you would need to do it in two places. First, you would need to delete them from ASP.NET user logins, and then you would delete them from ASP.NET users. But because the user ID, because this is a foreign key, you can't delete them here first. You can't delete them in ASP.NET users first. First, you've got to delete them from the ASP.NET user logins. No, and Scott, we probably won't be building in that whole user management piece. No. And when you log in, it even shows you here, got all these things. So like you could, got your external logins if you want to enable two-factor. It's got all these things kind of built in if you just click on this. Okay, so what we've just done, well, Scott, the trick with two-factor authentication is you need a service. You need to use a service, a paid service to send text messages. So the most common one for this is called Twilio. So for Twilio, you can use, for example, SMS for two-factor authentication. Here's their pricing. Let's see. So for SMS, so here you go. So if you want to set up 2FA, you need some kind of service that will send those text messages, and those are paid services. And Jinder, I'm just reading your question. Yeah, there are other options here. It's not only, you can, there are other options here that they've got. But you'll need something, some sort of paid service to do that messaging. Well, the key Manjinder is not for a specific, just reading, using no password. Well, all that it gives you some key from Google, but that doesn't mean they still don't have access to the user's password. Right? They would have access to their email address. So the account's still going to be protected from Google. So this integration, this is what This Google login is what I'm asking you to enable in your project. So you're going to need to create a new project in the Google console and generate a new set of API keys. You'll add those keys to your app settings.json. You'll add the Google authentication library to your assignment, and you will configure it in Startup. Now, I also want to, I'm going to go over your lab. So that's the end of today's lesson part, but I'm going to go, yes, that's right, Manjinder. And that's partly why the keys and the URI have to match, right? They can't go through any Google service. They've got to go through your Google project that we've specifically linked by the URI and the keys. So here is your assignment, okay? We've added Google sign-in together. You're now going to add Facebook sign-in to your Global Grub site. I've set a breakout group. I don't think we need to do it in breakout groups. So you can work with up to 2 other people. If you want to do this lab on your own, you can do it on your own. You want to do it, yes, if you put in a logo, then they want to verify it. So I would probably remove that logo. Thank you, Scott. Don't add anything else other than what we've added. So you'll go to the Facebook developer portal. You're going to enable Facebook login for a web application. And the callback URL is going to be /signin-Facebook. One thing to note with Facebook, in order to turn your app from development mode to production mode, they want a URL to a privacy policy. You can even just put in like the college homepage or college privacy policy, doesn't really matter. I think it has to be a live URL though. So Alex, you may have to, well, for now it's okay if it's just your testing one, but for your assignment, make sure you don't add a logo. So for the lab, you're going to be working with your global grub. You're going to enable Facebook login. You're going to publish it just to a private GitHub repository and invite me. Submit the link to the repository on Blackboard. If you're working with 3 students, you only need to just share one repository for this. Just make sure you include the names of everybody in the group, so I can give each of you marks for it. And then make sure you share your code so that everyone has a copy of it. Yes, Manjinder, for the lab, you're using Global Grub. You're not using your main project. You're enabling Facebook in the Global Grub project. Okay. The Facebook link is here. Well, hang on, Yulia. The Facebook link, so the tutorial is here if you want to see the tutorial. Shows you. You do not need to push this to Azure or Smarter ASP. So all I need is a GitHub link and your names if you are working with more than one person. You have until next Monday to submit it. There's also a quiz. Okay, if you're working asynchronously, then just complete the lab and submit it by next. So you can start on the lab now. If you want, Yulia, you don't have to do the lab now. You have until next Monday at 5 p.m. to do it. For your assignment, Scott, it's only Google. It's not even Microsoft. I did Microsoft last year, but Microsoft, you now have to set it up in Azure. And if your Azure account is disabled, we can no longer do that. So last year for the lab and the assignment, I had students use Microsoft. We're going to use Facebook instead. because of the limits with Azure. So for the lab, you're adding Facebook to Global Grub. For your assignment, you're adding Google to assignment 2. Yep, you can work with anybody you like on the submission. Okay. Yes, Shisato. For Google, right, by default, it was in test mode, and we had the ability to put it into publish mode. Okay. Facebook has an extra step that Google doesn't have. So you can see on Facebook, when you create it, your app will be in developer mode. In order to put it into production mode on Facebook, you have to enter the URL of a privacy policy. It won't allow you to change from development to production unless there is a URL to a privacy policy. Shisato, does that make sense? Well, I know we don't have one. You can put in basically any live URL. It can't be a local URL. If you want, put in a link to the Georgian College privacy policy. Yulia, the app type is going to be web. So just follow the steps that are in the tutorial here. I've put the link in the chat. So when you create an app, oh, the app type, sorry, here. You can just pick none. Doesn't really matter. I was thinking on the next screen, it's going to ask you the platform. Sorry, Yulia, I misunderstood your question. The app type doesn't really matter. Okay, so you are free to work with anybody you like, maximum of 3 people. So you can work on this now if you like. I will probably close the WebEx room. I'll stick around for a few minutes in case you have questions, but you're free to go to work on the lab and do your quiz. Okay, and I will see you next week. I'll put up the recordings a little bit later today.